Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you all. I hope wherever you are, your room is a little bit warmer than mine. It's a very cold Monday morning today. But thank you so much for joining us for Daily Devotions through Redeeming Life Fellowship. And today we're going to continue through our Revive School reading plan that's been leading us through the Old Testament prophets, but now jumping into the New Testament, particularly the book of Hebrews. And we're going to be focusing on Hebrews chapter 5, which is actually a very short passage, only about 14 or 15 verses long. And what I wanted us to do today is to get our minds wrapped around an idea or a figure that is not something that we typically think about in our modern ho-hum daily doings of 21st century life. In some sense, we have an idea about it, but in our minds, it's a figure or a concept that we don't really pay a whole lot of attention to. And the book of Hebrews does so not only in just a little bit, but actually spends a good deal of many chapters to talk about to help us understand who Jesus is, and in the way in which Christ is superior in this fashion. And because he's superior in this fashion, we need to hold fast to him because of who he is and how it is that he functions in this role. And to help get our minds wrapped around this, the idea, the picture you want to have in your mind is that of a priest. Now, unless you come from, say, a Catholic or maybe Episcopalian background, we don't typically think of priests very often. Perhaps, maybe for you, like me, the language of priest is the one that you typically think of when you're telling jokes. A priest and a rabbi walk into a bar and, so on and so forth. That's not, or maybe in another fashion, put quite negatively, that priests we typically think of in our common discourse is actually one that's very negative, where we think of priests in terms of their abuses of power and preying on the vulnerable. When we think about a priest, our ideas are sometimes a little bit muddled, a little bit opaque, but if they're not that, the most concrete ideas we think about with a priest are actually sometimes very negative ones. And if we can, for the moment, set aside those negative or cloudy pictures of what a priest is, I want to at least drop one idea in your mind as far as what it is that you want to think about when you're thinking about a priest, especially as the author of Hebrews continues to unpack how it is that Jesus is a great high priest. He's a priest like this certain Melchizedek. And so that if you want to see if Jesus is such a great high priest, well, you want to think about, oh, goodness, well, what does a priest do? In what way does the function of a priest, is it so important? And the main idea I want you to be thinking about when you're thinking about Jesus and Jesus being a priest is you want to think about a priest in the role of a mediator. In other words, a person who stands as the representative of people before God. You might put it this way. When you think of yourself as being, in a hospital, maybe you're on your deathbed. If somebody, in their kindness, will oftentimes ask whether or not if you want to see a priest or a pastor, even if you're on death row. That's one of the things that, at least within our society, we regard as something that is a sacred human right that before it is that you die, that you can finally set things right before God. And to do that, that you have to, that you're granted the right, the access to a priest, because it's the priest who you go to who functions as this mediator, so that even if you don't have this direct access to make things right before God, at least you can do so with the help of a priest who you regard as someone having kind of spiritual insight or wisdom, or in other words, access or connection to God that you don't have. That is, if nothing else, one of the essential aspects, the essential functions of a priest is that of a mediator, a person who's a go-between. And what the author of Hebrews is talking about, as he's talking about Jesus being this great high priest, in other words, for as many people as you've ever learned to depend upon as this go-between, to say, I don't have access before God, but I know somebody who does. And if this person has a sure access before God, I'm going to hold fast to them. I'm going to lean upon them. I'm going to trust them, because they are a priest. They are a mediator who is better or more reliable, more assured than anybody else who I can trust upon. And the author of Hebrews wants us to look at Jesus in that light, as indeed a great high priest, a person who affords this mediation, this connection with God, unlike anybody else. So that if in your heart and in my heart, we desire, indeed recognize our heart's desire, a desperate need for connection with God, our hearts should look to Jesus. And so let's read together about how it is, or why it is, that we should look to Jesus. We might as well actually just at least read through verses 1 through 10, because it's so short together. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and open up to Hebrews chapter 5. And in Hebrews chapter 5, it says, beginning in verse 1, every high priest is selected from among men and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He, that is a high priest, is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and going astray, as you and I are oftentimes wont to do, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he, a high priest, has to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as well as for the sins of the people. In other words, because of sin that priests themselves have to deal with, even the priest has to reckon with his own alienation from God, his own separation, so that even when we look at a high priest, or even in some cases a pastor, there's still a problem behind the problem, because even the priest himself has to recognize that he has to deal with sin and his own separation from God. There's always something that's a problem if the go-between, the mediator that we're depending on, doesn't have direct connection with God. That means our connection through that mediator is also disconnected. So that poses a problem. But let's continue reading. It says, no one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was. Aaron, if you to remember, was the first one who was selected as a high priest before God back in the book of Exodus. And it says, so Christ also did not take upon himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, you are my son, today I have become your father. And in another place, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Mind you, that is a quote from Psalm 110. And Psalm 110 happens to be the most quoted passage of the Old Testament in the New Testament. So Psalm 110 is a very important psalm in regards to how it features and how its significance is weighed in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, let's pause for 1 second. I need to take a sip of coffee. Now, one of the things that we think about when you want somebody who is a high priest is the sort of person who is indeed very spiritual. That I think kind of goes without saying. But by virtue of being so spiritual, oftentimes it's a high priest who, I don't know how else to say it, but is by virtue of taking this high honor upon themselves, becomes inflated with a spiritual pride and arrogance and hubris, which leads to so much of the priestly, pastoral, and spiritual abuses that unfortunately the church is so thoroughly plagued with today. But if we look at Jesus in the way that he's described in chapter 5, in these following verses, we'll see that he's not that kind of high priest. And let's see how it is that he's different. It says, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. It wasn't the high honor by a virtue of being a priest that assured his access to God, but that of his reverent submission, which should tell us something about our own attitudes that we should have as we look to Jesus, who has this kind of access to God by way of reverent submission. And it says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And now that's encouraging to me, certainly, because the source of our eternal salvation, Jesus Christ himself, our great high priest, is one who assures our access to God, that we can have reconciliation with God, is not by virtue of this great high honor of being a high priest, but assures our access to God by way through his reverent submission. That message certainly gives my heart hope, and I hope it gives your heart hope too, to know that what we see happening in Jesus's role in bringing about reconciliation to God is not one of us reaching up to God, but God reaching down to us. That in that picture, and what I'm reading in Hebrews chapter 5, is one of a glorious and beautiful grace and mercy that God does in order to bring about reconciliation to him. And so, I encourage you, in all of the things that we feel like we need to do in order to be able to bring ourselves into right relationship with God, to have the sort of righteousness that indeed makes us whole, because it makes us whole in the sight of the living God, indeed by the hand of the living God, we should not only look to Christ as the source of our eternal salvation, but also the attitude of Christ, and humbly and reverently submit ourselves to his lordship. And that if that's the sort of thing that it's going to take for us to be able to have indeed the sort of salvation that Christ offers as a great high priest, then that's what I want. because I know that's what it is that I need more than anything else today. I need a mediator who can make things right between myself and God, and Jesus is that great high priest. So I pray, go in the grace of God. Thank you so much for taking the time for us to read the Bible together. I hope if you haven't, do click subscribe to this YouTube channel so you get daily notifications to follow along with the reading plan. And look forward to the next time. Hopefully soon we'll all be able to meet together and continue to be a part of what God is doing here in Whitley County. So take care. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.